As with sex and money, and most important matters in life, many silly things are said about power. Perhaps the granddaddy of those silly things is the oft-quoted phrase, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Now, there is an important truth that Lord Acton's phrase does try to capture, but taken literally, it is false that power corrupts, and it misdiagnoses abuses of power. So the issue is worth a closer look. Power is the ability to do work. It comes in many forms, such as the cognitive power of thinking, the moral power of self-responsibility, the physical power of moving one's body and other objects, the social power of influencing others, and the political power of controlling others' actions, and so on. Now, abuses of social and political power, those are the ones we worry about the most, and as Acton's absolute power phrase suggests, the worst corruptions occur in the nations that absolutize or centralize political power the most. And social science data does bear this out. I recommend the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, published every year. It measures corruptions in all nations around the world and then provides the data and very attractive charts that illustrate some significant differences. But if you correlate the degrees of corruption in each nation with degrees of political centralization in each nation, then you get the following result. Countries with more concentrated and less accountable government power tend to be more corrupt. And countries with limited governments and better accountability have less corruption. So a very good argument can be made for limiting government power and dividing political power among different branches, as the checks and balances principle does. It's also, though, tempting to see the possession of power itself as the critical problematic factor. But consider these counterexamples, and there's lots of them, to the power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely phrase. Think about mothers and their children. How much power do mothers have over their children? Well, they have life and death power over their children. They control their infants' food intake. They decide how to protect them from predators and the elements. And they shape their children's thoughts and feelings. So the power that mothers and fathers have is close to absolute. Are mothers corrupted by that great power? Another example, teachers and the power that they have over their students. They do have an authoritative platform. They have a captive audience of kids for hours a day. Teachers can instill the fear of bad grades. They can indoctrinate their students, and so on. Does the possession of that power corrupt teachers? No, of course not. Right? Most mothers and teachers have a lot of power, but they use their power well to do the best of their abilities, while it's only a minority of mothers and fathers and teachers that are abusers of their power. So it cannot be that the possession of power is what causes abuse. What we say properly, correctly, in the cases of bad parenting and bad teaching is that the character of those involved is corrupt. So I think that taken literally, Acton's power corrupt aphorism is false. Instead, I think the agency formulation needs to be exactly reversed. It's not that power corrupts people. Rather, corrupt people abuse their power. It's not the power that does things. People who have power do things. Whether power is used for healthy purposes or corrupt purposes, that's up to the person. Or to put it in other familiar words, power is a tool, and how it is used depends on the character of the tool's possessor. The exact same tool can be used for good or ill depending upon the choice of whoever wields it. Now, I think the issue matters because it's not just idle semantics. The ontology of power has moral implications. If we think that power corrupts people, then any person who does something corrupt has an excuse. The power made me do it. And in those cases, power is conceptualized like in some fictional examples. Think of Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's famous fantasy novel, The Lord of the Rings, and Sauron, the big bad guy, has a ring, the one ring to rule us all. And the way the ring works in that novel and in the movies is whoever possesses the ring might start off as a decent fellow, but the power of the ring takes hold of him and makes him become degenerate. Think of the character Gollum, for example, who was just an ordinary hobbit initially. He came across the ring, and the ring exerted this power, this force over him. The power of it turned him into the rather frightening, freaky character that he was. So here we're thinking of power as some sort of external force that enters into people and causes corruption. And that's wrong. Consider some other counterexamples to the power corrupts aphorism, aside from mothers and teachers. Think about money. Money is economic power. Does acquiring wealth make one become immoral? If money is economic power, then we would say the more money you have, the more the money corrupts you and makes you immoral. That's not the way it is. Muscles are a form of physical power. Does bodybuilding turn you into a bully? Knowledge is intellectual power. Does the fact that you've now got a Ph.D. degree or you're pursuing advanced education and getting more and more knowledge, is that the thing that makes you become an evil genius? Or a Hollywood or famous musician example, fame. Fame gives one social power. Does the fact that one is successful in Hollywood, is that what turns actors into spoiled brats or jerks? But in all of those cases, right, rich people, muscular people, people with PhDs, Hollywood actors, and so forth, some people use the power that they then acquire, monetary, muscular, intellectual, social, in corrupt ways. Of course, there are rich bastards and evil scientists and thick-necked thugs and imperious prima donnas. Those are staples of literature and the movies. But we also know that many, many other people who become rich, muscular, knowledgeable, or they become movie stars, they do not become worse. Instead, they might become more savvy investors, more creative thinkers, more effective physical laborers, or they might become more exalted beings who grace us with their style and their glamour. The possession of power for those individuals elevates them. It does not corrupt them. So the right way to think about this then is that the possession of power is not the key factor. The character of the person is decisive. Power is the capacity, but how the capacity is exercised depends on the user. Taken literally, though, the power corrupt lines says that power is the agent and the person is the vehicle through which the power works. But I think that reverses the causal order. The person is the causal agent, and the power that person possesses and how that person is manifesting their power, that's the effect. Think of the religious story of Eve in the Garden of Eden. I think this contains a clear illustration of how the difference matters. So, who is the responsible party? Is it Eve or is it the serpent? If you think that what Eve did in the garden, taking the apple, was wrong, well, who exactly is to blame? Now, if we say Eve is a grown woman, she's in control of her mind, she knows certain things, she's in control of her body, she can make her hand go forward to grasp or not. She knows she's not supposed to take the apple, but of her own choice, she extended her hand to grasp it. Then, because she has the power, she is responsible. But of course, another interpretation points to the serpent, right? The devil in disguise. The serpent, then, on this interpretation, is the powerful being. It's able to tempt her and entice her and induce Eve to take the apple. In which case, Eve's power is diminished, and she is a more passive vehicle through which the dark powers operate. So, is Eve a sinner, or is she off the hook because the devil made her do it? Another kind of religious history example illustrates the difference in interpretations of power. Think, for example, of prophets. in many religious traditions. What is their power? Well, it's a kind of cognitive power. Prophets have the power to tap into the gods' minds or to receive special revelations from the gods. Consequently, a prophet has special social standing and might have special social power within a religious tradition. The prophet's power, though, is not due to something he did. Usually it's a he. Sometimes it's a she. Typically, though, the prophet is special because the God has selected him or her to speak through. That means that the God is the real power and the prophet is merely a tool of that God. Or the prophet's power comes from God and the prophet is only a mouthpiece. Or in yet other words, prophets are only kind of localized vehicles used by the real power of the universe. There are more contemporary and non-religious examples of the same view of power. These include Friedrich Nietzsche and the Michel Foucault type of postmodernists. When Nietzsche writes of the will to power as fundamental and as all, right, what does he mean? Now, Nietzsche and Foucault, they're atheists, but they offer a secularized version of that same religious prophetic theory. Nietzsche's power force is not a religious one or a spiritual one, but much more biological. And his great men, prophets like the Zarathustra's, who may be among us, and those who are to come according to him, they are special individuals in whom powerful, that's the power word again, it's powerful evolutionary forces that have converged to create something special. And those powerful evolutionary forces are working through those Zarathustra's to achieve something even more remarkable, to bring about the overman. Now, what's the status of such, as we might say, powerful, exceptional individuals? Well, the point, Nietzschean interpretation, is that those individuals did not themselves develop and are now using power. Rather, it's power that has developed and is using those individuals. Individuals are only the tools for Nietzsche, the vehicles. This is what Nietzsche is getting at when he says that every, quote, living creature values many things higher than life itself. And then tacks on, continuing to quote, yet out of this evaluation itself speaks the will to power. So the values that we have, it's not that the individual has chosen those values or created those values. It's that person's having that valuation. It's the will to power speaking through that living creature. So Zarathustra's purpose, his evolutionary purpose rather, is to announce, just as religious prophets do, what the future is going to bring. Zarathustra has been selected and is being used by the real purposes of reality for that prophetic purpose. Now, what Nietzsche is then saying is that the real causal power is the will to power. It's an ontological force, and that's working through individuals. It's not that those individuals develop their power and decide what they're going to do with it. And this applies to all of us in the Nietzschean framework. None of us is an individual that has autonomously built himself up into a powerful being, and that we're going to put our power to use and choose our values, and it's whether it happens is up to me. Rather, power is the actual reality. It's the metaphysical force, and we individuals are just localized centers through which the power operates. Each of us is constituted by power. So, what I'm going to quote here from the will to power and what Nietzsche means ultimately, right, in saying at the very end of the will to power in response to the question that he puts, and do you know what I take the world to be? And his answer to that question is, this world is the will to power, and nothing besides. And even you yourselves are this will to power, and nothing besides. Michel Foucault once described himself as, quote, simply a Nietzschean. And the Foucauldian understanding of power does follow the Nietzschean line. That's part of the postmodern dissolution of the individual to social power. Foucault is sometimes interpreted as an anti-humanist. And I think that is the correct interpretation, right? for reducing humans to vehicles through which power forces constitute themselves and contend. But that's a topic for another podcast. To return to Lord Acton, and in his case, his special focus is on politics, right, rather than metaphysics. I gave the counterexamples of the power that mothers have over their children and that teachers have over their students. But maybe we should ask, is there something unique about political power? Political power really is an awesome force, involving, as it does, the use of police power and military power to enforce politicians' decisions. And to Acton's credit, his own formulation contains a qualification as he carries on, a qualification of the popularized version. The popularized quote typically omits this. So here's the fuller quotation. Quote, "All power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it." Unquote. But even if we note that tends to qualifier, politicians, no matter how much power they have, they are in control of their power. There's no pre-existing tendency that makes politicians use police power or military power one way or the other. Power gives the politician options, and the politician chooses which option to exercise. That's where character comes into play. Politicians are not like the characters in Thrall to Sauron's ring. They are not like Eve being manipulated by Satan, nor is anyone. I want to end with a couple of quick comments about liberals and conservatives and contemporary American politics. Contemporary American politics, with all of its quirks, is inconsistent in its understanding of power, and I think both the conservatives and the liberals, both sides of the divide, are guilty of this. In my experience in reading, it's conservatives who most like the Acton line. They're fond of it and they quote it regularly, because the Acton line that power corrupts argues for limitations on government power. The possession of power is dangerous, they argue. It's a thing that should be checked, and so they're more likely to argue for government limitations. But conservatives also like to say things like, quote, "Guns don't kill people, people kill people," as that line suggests the right to gun ownership. But a gun is a concentrated form of power, and if power corrupts, then possessing gun power should corrupt citizens, just as political power corrupts politicians. Either Acton's line works in both cases, or it works in neither. If you're interested in limiting the power of politicians because you think that power corrupts them, then you should be gung-ho about limiting the power of gun owners because you think gun power is going to corrupt them as well. Now, so-called liberals on the other side of the divide, they standardly have a more benign view of government power, and for generations now, they've been much more content to give governments more regulatory control over our lives. But they're also afraid of guns, and they don't believe that people can be trusted with guns. Guns kill, they say, and so they argue that gun ownership should be severely restricted, or gun ownership should be entirely eliminated. But an extraordinary number of guns are at the disposal of our politicians. So if guns kill and we want gun control, then it follows that the biggest and most powerful guns, that is to say, the government's guns, those are the ones that most need restrictions. Again, there should be a consistency in the application of the principle here, but I'm not seeing it either from conservatives or from liberals on this issue. Now, power corrupts may not be literally true, but it is rhetorically powerful, and I think it does, when we think about it, point us to the real reason why political power should be limited. And the problem is cognitive. The problem is that we citizens always face a knowledge problem about our politicians. We can never be sure of their character. Police power and military power can, in limited cases, be used well, but in the hands of bad characters, it can be terribly destructive. And Democratic and Republican politics, those are a very imperfect selection mechanism to decide who's going to wield that power. Some of the politicians we select will no doubt corrupt the power that we entrust to them. So prudence, I think, dictates that we not concentrate power and that we build many checks into the political system.